None of the content on this or any episode of the Kratom Science Podcast, Kratom Science Journal Club, or on any page of KratomScience.com is intended, nor should it be considered, medical claims or medical advice. This is the Kratom Science Journal Club with Dr. Jonathan Cachat, neuroscientist and expert in psychopharmacology. In each episode, we discuss an article in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. Paper is called The Phytochemical Diversity of Commercial Cannabis in the United States. They had a large sample size of, what was it, like over 80,000 cannabis samples. I think it was over 6 states. And they used a bunch of different labs. Basically, in the abstract, it says, we show that commercial labels do not consistently align with the observed chemical diversity. However, certain labels are statistically overrepresented for specimen chemotypes. So basically what they're showing is what it's called, Sativa and Indica hybrid, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what's contained in the samples. They measured mostly like terpenes and high THC or high CBD, and then tried to see if what they're called had anything to do with it. They didn't find that. So it's kind of like the same thing with the Kratom,
so they were,
Kratom world.
They were basically identifying that different cannabis products and the labels that different states put out there, like right now, you maybe would get the Sativa Indica hybrid designation, and there's this notion that Indicas are more of a body high versus Sativa being more of a cerebral high.
Yeah.
And in general, when you look at the cannabinoid and terpene profile, there isn't necessarily a cannabinoid and terpene profile fingerprint or specific fingerprint for sativas, for indicas, and for hybrids. And so, this was, in previous studies, like the highest amount of commercial cannabis compounds or products that were analyzed, so their cannabinoid and terpene profiles analyzed, was like 900. And there are tens of thousands of them in this, recent study that we're reviewing now. And so, basically they're just saying, like, before we can provide recommendations on what an informative label would actually look like, we need to understand how diverse the cannabinoid and terpene profiles actually are, and see if it relates to anything, related to indica, sativa, and hybrid.
Yeah, and they talk about like genotypes, phenotypes, and chemotypes. It has been shown that the chemical phenotype, which is a chemotype of plants, can be used to classify cannabis into chemical varieties, or chemovars, with different ratios of cannabinoids and terpenes are hypothesized to cause distinct effects for human consumers. It says few studies have investigated the major and minor cannabinoids together with the terpenes, and none have performed a thorough chemotaxonomic analysis on the dataset with tens of thousands of samples across several legal cannabis markets. Mapping the chemical diversity of cannabis consumed by millions of people has important implications for consumer health and safety, such as identifying how many chemically distinct types of cannabis are currently consumed in legal markets. So this may be consequential if distinct chemotypes are later determined to cause reliably different effects. So essentially they're trying to find out scientifically what's the variation based on cannabinoids and terpenes. I don't know. They don't get so much into effects, but they do. They group them together based on terpenes and levels of THC or CBD. And their sample size was 89,923 samples from cannabis testing labs in 6 U.S. states. So,
which is a major improvement versus the last paper sort of in this line of research had 900 samples. So we're definitely looking at more samples, tens of thousands of samples in this study.
Yeah, and they used Leafly, which I'm sure people are familiar with, together with common industry labels and popularity metrics associated with them by the consumer-facing cannabis platform Leafly. Leafly's kind of like a cannabis review, so you can go on and give it 1 to 5 star ratings and say this helped me sleep or helped me, gave me energy. It's just basically a weed review site. They have a database of like all the cannabinoid levels and terpene levels and the different chemotypes. Yeah, like I said, it says we also examine the consistency of strain names. I was looking under results, and it says 84.5% of CBD dominant samples had total THC levels above 0.3%, which is interesting because hemp is defined as cannabis with THC levels below 0.3%. So there's a lot of hemp out there, I guess, that's CBD dominant but can't be classified as hemp legally. But I think most of the samples were THC dominant.
By far, yeah. Like 96% of them were. And so this distinction between a THC and CBD ratio is something that I think the market has gradually gotten a hold of. And so like you could have a 20-to-1, which would be high THC. You could have a 1-to-1, which would be essentially equal THC, equal CBD. And then you would have a 1-to-20, which would be really high CBD. The numbers can change. You could have a 10-to-1, a 5-to-1, a 2-to-1. But ultimately, this approach of categorizing chemotypes based on the THC to CBD ratio came from an earlier body of research that was generally funded by law enforcement. And so they would call type 1 or high THC the drug type. And then they would have the 1-to-1, the equal, and then they would have the CBD, high CBD type, and that would be like the hemp type or non-psychoactive type.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad that they're sort of shedding those type 1, type 2, type 3, and like drug type and non-drug type, because it was very law enforcement lingo. But you can see it really well in their first figure, the 3 distinct groups, and that the total THC concentration does have many more samples in it than the others. Of course, at this point, that's just based on what they have access to, 86,000 versus 2,000 and 1,300 for the balanced and the total CBD dominant. So, that'll improve as time goes on, but THC dominant is where everybody has been sort of pushing cannabis cultivation for the last several decades. And so that's where we get what we got.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because it's similar to Kratom. People, talk about Kratom strains, and they're not really consistent. They're not really strains. So it seems like cannabis industry has the same type of issue. It says here the cannabis industry also uses colloquial strain names to label and market products. Distinct strains of THC dominant cannabis are purported to offer distinct psychoactive effects. While the commercial use of nomenclature is not accepted by the scientific community, it's conceivable that distinct chemovars of THC dominant cannabis could cause different psychoactive effects on average. And then it also said if it's labeled Indica, Sativa, or hybrid, it has indistinguishable terpene composition, whereas if they're labeled by their dominant terpene, there's a better visual representation of data points by that label.
So let's go to strain name. Let's go back to strain name real quick.
Okay.
Because what strain name does presumably indicate is the lineage in which that cannabis came from. And so, if you have a Skywalker OG and the next one is a Skywalker OG that's truly from that original strain, and down the line, that would be presumably what it represents. And so as long as, and there's nothing stopping growers or companies from just calling whatever they have Skywalker OG, or if you get into like the cookies blends, like ice cream cakes, gelatos, sunset sherbets, like things start to get messy, and growers maybe might be able to get away with calling a gelato a sunset sherbet, and the consumers would never know the difference. It would be in the right ballpark. But in order to have the scientific community accept this sort of the strain name as a lineage, we would need a genetic component, and we would need that genetic component measured and then tracked through the supply chain. And I think recently you had talked to a group that does that.
Yeah, it's KREI. They're from Spain, and I think they call it KREI. We met with them, me and two other guys from Kratom Science, and they were just talking to us about they're trying to put a genetic fingerprint on different cannabis strains, so you could track them from their origin based on DNA rather than like in this one. It looks like they talk about they're looking at the terpenes and they're putting them in 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, so they ultimately found like 3 clusters of terpenes,
yeah,
on terpene pairs, but that's different than the cannabinoid and the terpene profile. That chemotype analysis is not intended to necessarily reflect lineage, but to reflect the effect profile and the flavor profile that you would have. So just a difference there between strains and the chemotype.
They also talk about the entourage effect, and it says it has been difficult to confirm experimentally due to onerous regulations that make it challenging to execute in vivo studies with controlled administration of the myriad of compounds found in cannabis. Is there a way to tell? This is what I was curious about. I mean, can you tell just from the terpenes what the effects are going to be in combination with THC dominant or CBD dominant?
Great question. And so, really, my decision to leave academia and university like funded and housed research was based on the fact that if I wanted to collect human consumption data on different cannabis strains, it would be easier in a commercial market than it would be in the university, research setting. And so, they talk about how limiting that can be. Like you're not allowed to bring people in and have them smoke 6 different strains and then report their effects back. But in the commercial market, we can, and that's where this research is sort of pointing to. And so in terms of the terpene profile and the different effects, so aroma and the sense of smell is the best way or best mechanism that consumers currently have in order to sort of pick a strain or a cannabis product that will give them the effects they want. So by their nose, so they could smell a strain and say, oh, I don't like that strain. And that strain might be like a high limonene strain. And they could smell another one and it's more earthy and musty and has caryopylene in it and maybe myrcene and say, this is the direction I want to go. What we're really running into at this point, though, is that there's no real way to it's like a limitation of language. So we know that their nose is the best way to do it. And we know that their nose doesn't lie. The smell doesn't lie. But we haven't yet aligned those specific aromas and profiles to specific clusters and groups of cannabinoids or terpenes. So we're not there yet. And there's a bit of a gap. And I think it comes from, like, how do you describe the experience of getting high and the difference between what is a Tangy and what is a Skywalker OG? Like, how do you verbalize and sort of standardize the effects and how they're different? I felt, sort of a headband effect and my back was loose, versus there's just like unlimited ways you could describe it. And none of it really sort of like summarizes it nice in a nice, neat, scalable or quantitatively based approach. And so we're still trying to align those. And what we see is that, especially for this one, like they found the highest on average terpenes was myrcene, beta-caryopylene, and limonene. And then they found different terpene subsets. And yes, you're right. If you list the top 3 terpenes, that's enough to relay to the customer versus listing 32 terpenes on a nutrition sheet. But that's sort of the difficulties and the gap that we're currently trying to bridge between aromas and the effect profile.
A lot of the roadblocks have to do with the fact that cannabis isn't federally legal. It says, in contrast to other widely used but federally regulated plants, e.g. corn and other crops regulated by the Federal Seed Act, there are no enforced rules for the naming of cannabis varieties. This stems from the fact that cannabis is not federally legal in the U.S., which prevents an overarching enforceable naming standard from emerging.
You're right. Yeah. But, honestly, I was talking to this with a group where we're trying to classify different cannabis strains based on their chemotype, their cannabinoid and terpene profile for an app right now. It's one of the projects that I'm working on. And what has been interesting is that especially comparing the West Coast to the East Coast. So like imagine on the East Coast, there's, let's say 30 cultivators in Ohio. And all of those cultivators had to get their strains or their genetics from most likely someone on the West Coast. And so they've got a Tangy, they got the Skywalker, they got the Blue Dream, they got the Trainwreck, and presumably in Ohio, they're keeping those names and carrying them on. So I sort of posed as a thought experiment to the group where it's like, but are strain names becoming more stable because it's a commercial marketplace now? It's not just, in the black market, you change the name or give it a new name because maybe that's, something you can add as a selling point to the customer. But ultimately in Ohio, and the strains that I purchased from the medical program do seem to line up with what my idea of those flavor profiles would be. So I think it's interesting to consider, like the effect of the commercial market and having it be on a state-by-state basis might actually be stabilizing the strain names to a certain degree. But we wouldn't be able to tell that or confirm that until genetics are, measured and included. And you're right, like, with corn and soybeans and other federally regulated agricultural products, there certainly is control and even IP around the specific genetics and naming rights that you can use. I don't know if I've told this story before, but we did have controlled substances in my lab at Tulane during graduate school, and we could get other Schedule I drugs no problem within 2 days. But to get cannabis, there was like several more forms. Like you'd submit your order form, then you'd submit a form to the Health and Human Services, and submit a form to NIH, and submit a form to the DEA, submit a form to at NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse. And then, several months later, you get this tiny little vial of THC, that was mixed with alcohol that we couldn't study separately. So it's almost as if cannabis has been in a special Schedule I. It's even different from the other drugs that are in the Schedule I. So it's been difficult for researchers to get a handle on it because of that federal prohibition, for sure.
It has a lot of measurements based on region, like on page 40 and 41 of the study. They show THC concentrations, CBD dominant varieties based on the 6 states that they're doing. And I guess that would be because they're all really separate legal markets, aren't supposed to cross over. It doesn't look like it's really variable from region to region, though.
Yeah, this was an interesting paper that actually had different states in it. Most of the papers don't have different states, but what they found that was interesting was the data from California. There were limited differences between the chemotype profile of Indica and Sativa. But if it was from the Netherlands, there were specific terpenes that were more often associated with Indica versus Sativa. And if it was from Washington State, there were no differences between Indica and Sativa. So there are differences state to state on whether or not the terpene profile actually aligns with the chemotype that they're seeing, or a different chemotype, a different terpene profile. So it's interesting, and you might would say, like, from the Netherlands, they are more concerned and tuned into the different sort of like genetic backgrounds. Like the Netherlands is one of the best, and most, for the longest time, a place to get seeds from, and they're sort of the keepers of the seed libraries, and so it makes sense that there would be differences there.
So you were talking about the academic versus commercial studies where you could actually have people smoke cannabis and have them report their effects, and I just have a quote that kind of relates to that. But studies seeking to falsify claims about the psychoactive and medical effects of different cannabis types should test chemical ratios that match those found commercially. If it's true that different chemotypes of THC-dominant cannabis reliably produce different psychoactive effects, then a sensible starting point is to design studies comparing the effects of common distinctive commercial chemotypes, such as those described by our cluster analysis. Would that kind of look like, just basically having a bunch of people smoke and report their effects?
Yeah, but even more importantly, what they're saying is that they should be smoking the chemotypes that are actually found in the commercial market. And so, really up to the last year, it's still up to the last year, but the DEA in the last year has now identified private companies to commercialize cannabis for scientific research. And before that, you had to get all of your cannabis from this single source location at the University of Mississippi that was growing like ostensibly the nastiest dirt weed that is even around. Like there's maybe it was 10% THC and it just had no terpenes at all. It was like a desert cannabis. And so the chemotype didn't match anything at all to what would be a Tangie or a Skywalker. You know, it didn't match the commercial profile at all. And so what they're saying is that if you're going to do this in a scientific setting, you need to get different strains that reliably relate to what is actually out in the commercial market. And so we're getting there. Like just now, the DEA got the authorization or made the announcement that they were intending to allow additional cannabis growers emerge for specifically for research purposes, and they were accepting applications. They accepted the applications and sat on them for several years, 2 to 3 years. And now this year, really, they're saying, okay, you guys can go ahead. So those operations are probably in the midst of a build out, you know, as we speak. But yeah, and so, you know, then once you actually have access to those commercial strains, what would it look like for a study like that? So, you know, the most true to form would be to have participants come in and either smoke from a joint, or most likely they would have to do some sort of vaporization. So even if it was like a vape bag, like a volcano, the ethics committee would probably prefer that they did it through vaporization. And then you would have to have some sort of, you know, survey or a set of questions that they then answer. You know, they do it before, they do it after, you know, they do it like right after, and then maybe an hour later, they do the same questionnaire over and over. And then once you get those results, you would want to try to find groups within those survey responses and match that to different clusters of cannabinoid and terpene profiles to see if like people are reliably reporting the same effects for the same terpene clusters. And I actually have a good story about that if we want to get into it.
Yeah, sure.
Are you familiar with the cannabis products called Dosist?
No.
So they came out in California a few years back, and the idea was that you would buy a little pre-filled pen. One was for sleep, one was for, I think, energy. Well, I don't know exactly what the different types were. I could probably look it up real quick. But the whole marketing effort was that these are specific doses and specific formulas for these specific activities. So yeah, it looks like they got calm, explore, sleep, and relief. And so, you know, a specific dose based on and a specific formula to provide certain effects. And the group that made that, the research that was based on that, is actually one of the largest studies where they had consumers smoking specific formulations, specific terpenes, either present or not present, and then recording those effects. And I think there was something like 700 individual humans that participated in this study. And so it's not commercially reported, but it is exactly the type of study design and research methodology you would want to align them. But what came out of this research now, and what we're talking about and working with this lab on, Pure Analytics out in Northern California, is called the Terping Quotient. And so in many ways, the THC to CBD ratio, or just giving information to consumers in ratio form, seems to be something that people can quickly adopt and understand. The 20 to 1, 0 to 1, 1 to 1, 1 to 20. So the terpene quotient, or TQ, terpene quotient, is a ratio where there's 1 through 3 in the front, and in the back, there's 4 through 7. And the 1, 2, 3 represents the most dominant terpenes, so the terpene pairs. And let's say that it could be one of the groups that was found here, like myrcene or caryopylene, and then 2 would be limonene. And so ultimately you end up with like, okay, Jack Herer is a 1 to 4, a Tangie is a 2 to 3, or 2 to 5, and so on and so forth. So it's a way to, they used the research from Dosist to make the Dosist products, but then they also started understanding which terpenes lead to consistent effects between different humans. Like to sleep, what were the terpenes that actually induce that type of sleep. And so, in working with this app group now and working with this Samantha Miller over at Pure Analytics in Sonoma County, we are hoping to build on the Smith 2021 paper that we're reviewing now and their data set, which is all available online, to calculate the terpene quotient to then see how that results to the different clusters and effects that we get. So it's pretty exciting. I think it's one of the first that has real sort of 700 people and scientific data and scientific rigor that went into it. And it relates those terpene profiles to effects, not necessarily to flavors or tastes.
Wow, that's awesome. That's pretty interesting. Yeah, because it even said you could bring it up Tangy. It said that one from their samples seemed to be inconsistent. 62.5% of product averages for Tangy fall into a single cluster, whereas this other strain, Purple Punch, it was 96% of product averages fell into cluster 1, which is high.
Right.
Caryophyllene, limonene. So what about even, because you've talked before about THC, lab shopping, companies want to get the highest THC because it sells better. Obviously, like with Tangy, within these samples anyway, it's like you can't just get a Tangy from one company and expect the same kind from another company. What about consistency within the same company? Because I've found a couple that I liked, and the thing with Pennsylvania is it's never the same stuff every time you go. I don't know why that is. Probably because they didn't issue enough grow licenses. But every time you go to the dispensary, they have different stuff. So you can't really can't really even get anything consistent by name if you tried. But is it going to be even?
The lab shopping, of course, is a big deal, because if the data that you're looking at in these large scale analyses that where the the THC to CBD ratio is so critical as a differentiation factor, it seems to be, one of the best figures in this paper is the figure 10, a potential scheme for classifying commercial cannabis based on cannabinoid and terpene profiles. And you can see that their first way to distinguish it is is it high THC? Is it 1-to-1, or is it high CBD? And then there's another okay, are there any minor cannabinoids that we are finding over 2 or 3%? There's not a lot of strains out there that exist like that. But if it does in fact exist, you want to note that. But if the numbers are bad or artificially inflated, you would certainly see situations where the products are not falling into the same clusters. 96% of those Purple Punch strains falling into the same cluster is really good, really good for the clustering model and how it's differentiating it to show that. But if the strains are separated 50% in cluster 1, 50% in cluster 2, is that really because they were different, or is it because there were errors at the lab? Especially with the cannabinoids, and if labs even measure the terpenes, a lot of the available data out there doesn't have those terpenes. And so this is just an anecdote from Pure Analytics as well. When we were talking about the terpene quotient, she was mentioning that out in California these days, you used to have 25% THC in order to even get into a dispensary. The dispensaries wouldn't buy any cannabis products that were lower than 25% THC. And now she's saying that currently the trend is pushing to say, we're not going to buy anything unless it's above 30% THC. That we're not going to even put it on our shelves unless it's a 30% THC or above. That's a real problem, because the average THC value in California is 22%. Even lower than the 25. And so it's a significant issue that really needs to be addressed. And the regulators don't seem to want to tap it, or get into it yet, but they're going to have to, and maybe they'll take the feds to do it. And it's unfortunate, Samantha Miller, I really trust her and her scientific rigor. And it was sort of the same situation with me when I was the lab director. It's if the lab director has a, quote, reputation for giving low numbers, they're not giving low numbers, they're giving the real numbers. And so, that's sort of an indicator. If anyone ever says, oh, that lab gives low numbers, they're not giving low numbers, they're giving the real numbers. There's no inflation. And so if you want a true scientific assessment, go, send your products to the labs where there's, quote, low reported numbers
Yeah.
and see what comes back, because that's what the real numbers are. Hopefully that'll change.
That's just funny. The lab shopping, the whole thing is just amusing. I want to get the highest
wild.
I mean, 30% is like a lot. I mean, what if somebody
who
wants a
that
mild,
like 20-year-olds?
Yeah. It's it's definitely, especially like older people who just want a little bit of weed for their back that hurts and stuff. They don't want to get like stoned.
I've seen that. I've seen it on podcast advertisements now, like dad weed, where it's a CBD
grass
plant with the Delta 8 on it, and it's only like a 10% Delta 8, so it's a low THC.
Yeah.
From the perspective of like projects that I'm currently working on, like this recommendation engine. So like, how Netflix says, if you like this, you may like this. Well, we're working on an app that would say, okay, if you like Jetty's Tangy cartridge, you might also like these, specific products. Cresco's this or whatever. And there's also value to companies like Cresco for demand planning to have the quantitative approach to that. And so what I sort of took away from this paper is that when you evaluate your classification models, you want to approach each location where the data is from separately before you merge them, right? So they analyzed California, then they analyzed the Netherlands, then they analyzed Washington, and they found those differences in whether or not the terpenes were reliably fit within a distinct category. And it was limited in California. It was very clear Indica, Sativa, Netherlands, and there was no difference in the state of Washington. And so as we collect all of these different data sets and merge them together, you want to be mindful, like there are several labs in Michigan that make their data public, all of their results public. And so we're analyzing on a state-by-state basis. And that also goes into the recommendation of like what we have to collect about the user, and we need to know where the user is in order to provide the best recommendation. The most common terpenes being myrcene. I think everybody knows that pretty well, but myrcene, beta-caryophyllene, and limonene as the top three most common terpenes. That's good to know, and I think that makes sense. And then they also found the sort of three different clusters. So caryophyllene with limonene, myrcene with pinene, and then the terpinolene as the third cluster. So these three clusters based on terpene pairings are very interesting. No study has sort of reported results like that yet. And it's really interesting to say, okay, well, let's look at the other data sets, ones that weren't realized in this one, and say, okay, does the caryophyllene limonene cluster, so is that the two highest terpenes in these other strains? Does that hold true? So looking at this in different data sets that weren't analyzed by Smith et al., and relate that. So do we find a specific cluster with caryophyllene and limonene? Are those the two top terpenes in any strains or a group of strains? Are myrcene and pinene the two highest strains in others? How much of the strains in this other data set fit into the myrcene pinene cluster? Are there other novel terpene compounds, or one or two that can be paired together that we find that reliably or confidently results in different groups or different classifications? Ultimately, too, I would say this group has really been at it and doing some good work. Smith, Vierga, Keegan, and then of course Nick Jacobs, who is a neuroscience PhD at Leafly. He has several papers out where he's doing this type of analysis. The biggest one before was based on lab shopping and reported THC values. But now he is, sitting on top of that Leafly data and is the corresponding author for this paper, which generally means that he was the driving force behind this paper and getting that group together and performing the analysis. So it's always good to keep an eye on stuff Nick's up to if you're following cannabinoid science. Also, if you're following psychedelic science. Nick Jacobs is a good follow, and definitely a trustworthy scientist out there performing statistics in a way that you don't have to really second guess. He really is out there doing good stuff. Awesome. And again, this data set that they use is being shared. It's available to download. It's like a supplemental material for this paper. And so you got to give any group of researchers kudos when they are providing open data and open access to their data for the science. It's the way it should be. It's not always the case, but the movement for open data and open science is getting louder and moving forward. So, cheers to them on that, because, other groups like me and these app developers can have access to that set, join it with other sets that are shared, and come up with something new, like sort of iterative development is what science is. Overall, I think this is a really important paper in the classification of cannabinoids and terpenes. Of course, and we mentioned at the top, the tens of thousands of samples that they evaluated compared to, a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, when the highest was 900. So this represents a significant advancement there.
Thank you, Dr. Jon Cachat. Check out the cannabisdiary.co. Check out KREI Method. It's a company that's trying to put a genetic stamp on cannabis strains, and I have a link to them in the description. And check out this study that we talked about. There's a link to that in the description. Please like, subscribe, share, rate, review. The music is Captain Big Wheel. The song is Moon Runner. Kratom Science Journal Club is produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for KratomScience.com. Take care.